we got x going to infinity of 1 minus cosine x over x. So be careful about this. A lot of times kids will see this part right here, and they'll make, oh, well, I remember the special trig limit, this has to be 0. But this only equals 0 if x is headed to 0. Okay? This is our rule. If x is going to 0, then this fraction heads to 0. But that's not what's happening here. We have x going to infinity. So now we've got to think about this separately. Now, again, x going to infinity means, what's the horizontal asymptote? So a lot of times if you don't know L'Hopital's rule, and if you don't know much about these functions, and it's a fraction, you just think about what's the top doing, what's the bottom doing. Because if the bottom's getting bigger than the top, then the fraction has to be headed to 0. Very similar to this rule. If x is going to infinity of 1 over x, well, that goes to 0 because x is getting so big that 1 over this huge number just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and it heads to 0. So let's take a look at this. If x goes to infinity, well, cosine of x, no matter how big x gets, cosine is always stuck between -1 and 1. Cosine's graph looks like that guy, okay? So this is cosine of x. So cosine of x is always stuck between -1 and 1. So 1 minus that number, it's just going to be some small number. 1 minus 1 is 0, and 1 minus -1 is 2. So 1 minus cosine x is always stuck between 0 or 2. But as x gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, yeah, the top's going to be waving back and forth between 0 and 2, but x is getting so big that it doesn't matter what the top becomes anymore, since the top is staying relatively small, and the bottom becomes so big that the bottom eventually drags this thing down to 0. If you were to graph this function, if you were to graph 1 minus cosine x over x, you would see that this thing looks like, at 0, it's undefined, so we won't talk about that. But eventually, if you graph it out, it's going to look like this. It just gets closer and closer to 0. It bounces back. Let's exaggerate that a little bit. It bounces back and forth between positive numbers and 0, and it gets super small. And that's happening because the top is staying small. Sometimes people write like this. The top is small over a huge number, a very big number, and that goes to 0. This goes to 0 as the top stays small and the bottom gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It goes to 0.